Creative Moment, episode 10. We are on episode 10 now. We might just do this as kind of a season finale thing, go 10 episodes per season. There's not going to be any breaks between it. We're just kind of keep going with it, flow through the seasons. I'm Dante Bullhauer. I'm a photographer.
Jamie Bullhauer, writer.
And we're here to talk all things creativity. So on episode 10 today, we are talking, as we crack open our bubblers, we are talking about style and originality. Now, they're kind of two different topics, but they kind of have, we kind of talked a little bit before this about kind of some common threads between the two. So I want to talk about how we kind of developed our own style. Everyone has a style with creativity. You know, we've said it 1,000 times on this podcast. You know, creativity is about expressing, you know, emotions and part of who you are. And so that kind of leads into then, you know, your preferences, whether it be writing, photography, what you do that defines your style, that makes you kind of, this is a piece of your, someone could look at your work and be like, yep, he wrote that, he did that.
So for those in my English class, it's that voice or tone type of situation.
And so kind of give me some background on how you developed your own style, when you kind of realized like, okay, this is the stuff that I like to write. This is kind of my voice, my tone, my style.
And it's really interesting to thinking about this because obviously, you know, since the pandemic especially, and getting into real study of poetic forms, sonnets, danzons, you know, just different stuff, my skill set has improved, and actually kind of my style, I guess, is actually kind of changing a little bit in that regard, because in some ways, but I just wrote a new poem and presented it at the open mic, and it was kind of, I guess, my fundamental style. And over the week, I look back on some of my earlier poems, and it was kind of interesting because I still kind of do it. I have this habit of having these lines of three, like they might be preposition type of lines or something. And I'm not sure exactly where that came from. That was just something I just felt. But I will have to say that my original style actually probably was influenced the most, and here's what we'll talk about originality later, hopefully, by Langston Hughes. As a poet, and he's known as kind of a jazz poet also and stuff, but honestly, if you look at just one book of his, or if you get a volume of his best poems, like hardly any of his poems are the same, as in form, as in rhyming scheme, as in structure, and he has a jazz kind of rhythm to many of the longer ones, but like A Dream Deferred, okay, short, very imagery based similes, to other poems that like Weary Blues, which actually has, you can feel the music involved in it. And I read, or my English teacher, I believe I was a freshman, maybe an 8th grader. Sorry to say, getting old, your brain, you kind of sometimes forget, but I read that, and that was like, this was cool. It wasn't Shakespeare, it wasn't, and that kind of just gave me the chance to try to write basically kind of how I heard the idea in my head.
Interesting. Yeah.
But how do you get, because actually I believe I could tell, if somebody put up some photos, I could tell yours from other people's. So how do you do this in photography?
So there's kind of two different parts to style, kind of your own watermark on an image type thing. One is when you shoot it, and the second is when you edit it. The editing one is probably the more obvious one. But in terms of composition, like how I frame up a shot, how I compose it, that is something that I still kind of struggle with. I feel like I'm not the best at it. I'm always looking at other people's photos and trying to figure out how did they shoot this, I like that angle. How can I incorporate that? And so composition, I feel like I'm still developing my style because I feel like it's harder to be composition is kind of harder to read because, if you're not taking the same photo at the same spot as this person, then composition is kind of, I want to incorporate a composition similar to that, but if I'm not in a similar situation, sometimes it can't happen. And so that's something that I still feel like I'm developing. And I couldn't quite tell you, just like it's still kind of very early. I feel like I center everything and I'm trying to get past the create some
I can
different
kind of see that a
angles
little bit
instead of having everything be dead center, because I like that kind of like focus on one thing, composition. But so I'm trying to venture out there. Editing, again, we're going to talk about the originality part. I am pretty hard on contrast. My shadows are pretty deep. My highlights are pretty bright. And that's heavily influenced by Peter McKinnon, my favorite photographer. He is a little more punchy, contrasty than I am, and I've been trying to kind of steer a little bit away from that. My style's changing a little bit to kind of have more detail and almost like a softer contrast instead of kind of a harder curve that I started out with, where I'd really, bring the shadows down really, really dark, where now I'm trying to keep that contrast but have more of a like cinematic filmic look where there's more detail in the shadows and highlights. And that's like heavily influenced by Peter McKinnon. It's heavily influenced by the photographers that I follow on Instagram. I have found that I've been following a lot more that are like the style that I want to do. And so that's kind of been influencing me. I see a photo and I'm like, okay, I want to copy that color scheme, that contrast, that thing. And so that's kind of what developed me. Peter McKinnon was basically carbon copy at the beginning. And now I feel like I'm starting to kind of develop something more unique to me, where it's a conglomeration of a bunch of other people's styles, but just kind of how I want to use this part of their style, this part of that, to make kind of my style.
So there's two things that were brought up as you're talking about how do you actually produce your style? How do you find it? And first off, Ray Bradbury did an interview way in the 70s, and he actually admitted that it took him 10 years before he wrote a short story that felt like his. Like, this was me. And he would do... so the number one thing is to actually take a lot of photos, write a lot, paint a lot. Like, you have to experiment with things. And the other one, and this is known in the writing world to a degree and stuff, especially starting out, is, and in photography, is to actually write out a passage from your favorite author. Exactly, write out word for word and see how that feels to write their sentence structure. See how your brain wants to maybe change it, but at that time, just actually do that so that you actually physically and mentally go through the same process, which, as you were talking about Peter McKinnon and stuff, taking that same tool set of the contrast with the shadows, and because that gives you a little bit of a strength and skill set, and then you can feel like you can move on and you start to develop and work and connect to the way that you see, the way you want the finished product. So there's two things that happen. One, you just got to continue to work. And even like I said, I think my style is changing a little bit, especially with the poetic forms. But yeah, my first this original poem, like, it just was like, yeah.
Yep.
And I think I had Sebastian read it, or maybe Mom, and I'm like, this feels like when I wrote in college, like that energy, and things like that. But then to honestly copy, I know in art class, they talk about, like, when you're studying watercolors or things like that, that they'll kind of copy that famous picture and then move on to their sense. And so obviously we're not saying you publish that stuff. That's your work doing that, and that helps you. And
your style will kind of organically appear. You'll kind of start to notice, okay, I really like how they did this. I want to implement this. This happens a lot with the photoshopped graphic design, I will go, before every single graphic I make, I'll go on Pinterest just to get some inspiration. I'll scroll through like 4 or 5 things, and then I'll download 1 or 2 of them and use those not as like a copycat, but, oh, I like how they did this. This looks kind of like something that I would like to do, and then tweak it to put my own style on it and make, a graphic that has some of those similar elements, but I put my own like finishing touch on it. And so it just kind of organically comes out as I'm making the graphic. It's not something like I'm not intentionally trying to be like, what is me? It just kind of happens with how I create it.
Yeah. Which goes to our comfort zone, like your
Yes.
skill set. And
Yes.
as that strengthens, that allows you to express yourself.
Yeah. And so that kind of brings us to this other point we want to talk about.
Well, I got one more.
Okay,
I got
yep.
one more thing that I think you need to do if you want to work on your style. Try to
Figure it out.
Figure it out. One, you got to put the work in. You got to do that. You just, even if it's just junk and stuff, just working on it. 2, copy who you appreciate, who you look up to. And again, that's just the work, doing those things. And then paying attention to how you think as you do that. I'd like, as you said, well, I would like to do this. Like, yeah, pay attention to how your heart, your spirit, your muse, whatever, like says, ooh, I would maybe do it this way, because that's you coming out. The third one's a little bit interesting. It's expanding the tools and the technology that you have. All right, because we think about our topics, even though this is pretty still organic. There is a difference, and I'll just use writing as an example. There is a difference from me typing on a Google Doc, me writing in the pencil and paper, and there's a little bit now as I've expanded and started doing some like the last 5-6 years or so, actually vocalizing it into my Google Doc, actually speaking it. And I think as you work with different tools, like if you take a photo with your phone versus your top end camera, versus just grabbing an instant camera and doing some stuff, that expands your repertoire, but also shows you how your thoughts come across because of the tools that you use. And it doesn't mean you have to, I got to write longhand my next novel. No, it's actually doing something in a different medium that exposes you to the barriers and to the things that you are working on, and how some things actually you might find work better for certain things. So as I try to expand poetry, I'm trying to hear it better. So when I actually speak it or even record it a little bit now, it's like I understand how the line break has to happen at a different word than what it might look like on the page.
Interesting. Yeah, so this summer I purchased a film camera, so like an old-fashioned like film camera, and I've been wanting to kind of use it over the summer. I've been just busy, haven't got it, but that's something that I want to develop a style of my film photography, figure out, because there's so much less you can do on a film camera than like the camera we're recording on right now, and I just want to see how that changes.
Yeah.
Not only how I just shoot film, but then how it translates into just kind of my overall portfolio of like my style.
Yeah. See, we're already. I knew that you did, but we hadn't. Yeah, I know you hadn't got the chance to actually use it yet to really work on the craft part.
Yeah. And so, hopefully that's a little bit of insight if you're, just kind of figuring out like how do these people have that unique. Like, oh, that's a Jamie Bullhauer poem. That's a Dante Bullhauer photo. You talked about, 1, it's the work, it's the reps. With anything, the more you do it, the more you'll just kind of recognize that. It'll kind of come out. 2, just think about when this stuff is happening. Like, what do you like? Pick your parts out of your favorite, authors, photographers, whatever. Copy it, do whatever, just figure out what stands out to you, what kind of speaks to you in those moments. And then 3, excuse me, like we just talked about,
expanding your tools,
expanding your toolbox to figure out what parts kind of incorporate into you.
Yeah.
And so this relating to point number 2 of that with originality, I want to talk about Jamie Windsor. He's a YouTuber and photographer, and he talks about how no idea is original. He has a video about it. It's super interesting. I'll link it in the description, but it's interesting in this creative world how, you take ownership of your poem, I take ownership of my photos, but, and especially this, again, we're talking about graphic design, this comes out a lot where I feel kind of an imposter syndrome type thing. Like, every idea that you have is essentially just picking ideas from other people and, morphing them into, like, subconsciously morphing them into your own creation. So like I said, like when I do graphic design, I will scroll through Pinterest, find stuff that I like until something comes together in my head where I can see the vision, I can see what I want to make. That idea in itself is, yes, it's my idea, but it is also everybody else's ideas that I drew whatever it was from. And the reason I had that idea, it was not just something that I just came up with abstractly in my head. It was because I saw these things. I wanted to recreate what they did. And so we've talked about this a lot, how no idea is original. Everything is, something that's really been thought of before. I kind of want to hear your thoughts and how that plays into writing, especially.
Well, so yes, and obviously as we deal, if you've been in English class, we talk about plagiarism and giving proper credit. And even, like I said, point 2, copy those people, again, not to publish it, but to see how that all works. But I disagree about it being original on kind of a deeper level. And I'll try to articulate that because to a degree you have to recognize, yes, anything we learn, anything we build off of is something that's in the past. And that's just how we grow. But that's the catch, as you mentioned, that this moment, so here's where I'm going to get deep. Every artistic expression is a historical record of your spirit at that moment. And that is the most original thing that there is.
I agree. And I agree in the sense, yes, that, like, the idea that I had in that moment after, seeing those graphics or whatever, the idea that I had for that graphic is mine. And no one has had that specific idea. And Jamie Windsor articulates this really well in his video. He's really thorough with it. But just kind of in the sense that he talks about these musicians that had written, these pieces, and they ended up getting trademarked or whatever. They got sued because the music was so identical to a piece that had already been published that, like, it was just straight up plagiarism. But he had never even heard the song before, right. And so he talks about, kind of the originality, like even that idea that he had never even heard that song before. He came up with that tune, that musical piece, and it ended up being almost like the exact same thing as someone else had already created. And so that's kind of where it lies into, if I put a paper tear down this graphic and make it look like, the page is torn up, that idea is not original at all. And
no.
Like, there's so many people have done that, and the
Do you
only
know how
reason
many
I know
love
about
poems
it,
there are?
Yes.
I mean,
and so it is kind of an interesting thing to debate because, yes, your ideas are original, but those ideas are sparked from other people. Like, the other photo, like, you have these ideas due to the fact that even subconsciously you saw this.
And I'm not disagreeing, but I'm taking this to a deep spiritual level in that sense. And poetry maybe is a little bit easier per se, because sometimes your photography and stuff, there's a lot of work involved in. But at that moment, and as we have stood on the idea that our creativity is an expression of ourselves, that is our historical moment recorded for the rest of whatever, time. You can, when I'm gone, you can still probably buy my books on Amazon. It's so that aspect is such a powerful thing to think about, and why we have also reinforced to have the courage to go with the muse. Because if creativity is an expression of ourselves, that moment, that creative element, that picture, that welding sculpture, whatever, is the most creative thing that we can express. The most original, because it is the accumulation of all that we've felt, have gone through, have learned, and we've put it there into the real world at that moment.
Steve. Yeah, I mean, I see both sides.
And I agree, it is, because if I don't have some of these experiences, as you know, in my history, some of these poems don't get written. But again, how many people have gone through tough childhood and have written about that? But yet their poem is their record. My poem is my record. It is like the historical record of that emotion, that thought, whatever brought into reality.
Yeah. And so with this kind of, as I'm trying to soak this all in here, I agree with you in the sense that the idea itself is original. But in terms of, I guess, how the idea came about, like the context of it is not, specific to you. It is, but it's like you talked about, a lot of people have gone through, tough times. A lot of people have fallen in love. A lot of people have, committed to a college for sports, whatever. And so that the generic, I feel like the generic part, no, your ideas are not original. If I took a cool photo that I don't think I'd seen someone take before, that's not an original idea. Like, I didn't invent that idea, but it is 100% my idea, because all the things leading up to it, all the contextual factors of that led up to me being able to produce an idea that is 100% mine.
Right.
And
which then is your style.
Yes.
In which that artistic thing expresses is true to you, and you can see the style or voice that you have.
I think we've come to
Yep.
somewhat of an agreement. More of just me being wrong-ish.
No.
Not wrong, but seeing things in a different light.
Yep.
So yeah, that kind of wraps it up for us. If you guys have any thoughts about this, I would love to hear
Share
them.
in the comments. This could be a fun one.
Yes, please explain to us what originality is, how your ideas, just lay it all out there, because I would be super interested to read on that. So yeah, hopefully we provide some value, help you guys kind of figure out how to develop your own style, kind of 3 different ways that you can learn what your style is. And then, you can also, that stuff isn't just starting out with your style. Every once in a while you fine tune it, you go back and you copy that Langston Hughes poem, or, you just take another deep dive into the editing process, like how they change this color, that sort of thing, just to kind of fine tune it, keep it, fresh, and things like that. And with that was The Creative Moment, episode 10, season finale of season 1. So we hope to see you guys in season 2, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.